They called him America's favorite hero. But behind every hero is a story no camera dares to capture. Before the fame, before the laughter, Bob Crane was already recording something else, himself. And when the tape stopped rolling, the mystery began. Bob Crane's story begins not with the flashing lights of Hollywood, but with the quiet hum of a drumstick tapping against a snare. Born on July 13, 1928, in Waterbury, Connecticut, Bob grew up in a disciplined household where order and structure were as essential as the rhythm in his hands. As a young boy, he showed an unusual intensity and focus, traits that would define him both on and off the screen. While other kids played baseball or ran around the neighborhood, Bob practiced his drums, relentlessly perfecting each beat until his palms ached. Music was more than a passion, it was his first language, one he understood better than words. By the time he reached high school, Crane's talents had earned him local recognition, and he quickly became a fixture in the regional jazz scene. His precision and control behind the drum set were unmatched, but the drive to master his craft came from something deeper. There was an unspoken pressure, a need to prove himself, not to his family, but to the world. Bob wasn't just playing for the love of music, he was measuring his worth in every note, every performance. His childhood taught him that if you wanted to be seen, you had to be perfect. After graduation, Bob moved to New York to pursue his dreams, eventually landing at CBS Radio in 1950. It wasn't long before his charismatic voice and sharp wit caught the attention of executives, and by the mid-1950s, he had moved to Los Angeles to become the host of his own show at KNX Radio. Bob was quickly establishing himself as one of the most talented and versatile announcers in the industry, with a magnetic presence that made him a favorite among listeners. His ability to interview celebrities with ease and keep his audience engaged made him a standout in the competitive world of broadcasting. Yet, even as he sat behind the microphone, making others laugh, something gnawed at him. Fame came easily to Bob, but it was the validation that he sought above all. Behind the bright smile and the ever-charming radio voice was a man who was constantly assessing his performance. He didn't chase fame for fame's sake, he measured himself by it. Every compliment, every moment of recognition became a gauge of his worth. But with fame came a price that Bob would begin to understand as he transitioned into television. In the early 1960s, Bob's ambitions outgrew the confines of radio. CBS executives, impressed by his natural charisma, urged him to make the leap to television. His first small roles in shows like The Donna Reed Show and The Dick Van Dyke Show were well received, but it was 1965 when he landed his breakthrough role as Colonel Robert Hogan in Hogan's Heroes. The show, set in a World War II POW camp, was a comedy that placed Bob front and center as the quick-witted, morally upright leader of a ragtag group of soldiers. The role seemed tailor-made for him. The audience immediately warmed to his clean-cut, all-American charm. He became the embodiment of everything viewers loved about television at the time, wholesome, comedic, and reassuring. But as much as the role defined him, it also trapped him. Bob was no longer just playing a character, he was becoming one. The face of Colonel Hogan, with his wide smile and trademark humor, became synonymous with Bob Crane himself. On screen, he was the epitome of perfection, always calm, always in control, always the hero. But off-screen, that same need for control began to manifest in a more troubling way. Bob became consumed by the desire to ensure that every performance was flawless. He didn't just act. He obsessed over every line, every moment, as if his entire self-worth hinged on how well the audience received him. His marriage to Terzian, his first wife, had begun to show signs of strain even before Hogan's Heroes began. While Bob was winning the hearts of millions of viewers, his home life was quietly unraveling. The demands of fame, combined with his relentless perfectionism, left little room for intimacy or connection. His relationship with Anne, who once understood the quiet man behind the persona, slowly crumbled under the weight of his emotional detachment. His career was soaring, but the man beneath the surface was retreating further into himself. In 1970, and filed for divorce. Bob, now struggling to balance the demands of a high-profile career with the loneliness that came with it, sought solace in his work. He remarried in 1970, this time to Sigrid Valdis, who played Hilda on Hogan's Heroes. To the public, Bob had the perfect life, a successful career, a beautiful wife, and a family. Yet behind the scenes, his obsession with perfection and his fear of losing relevance were growing stronger. Bob had become not just a performer, but a man who needed to be constantly seen, constantly validated. This obsession with validation bled into his personal life in unexpected ways. While Hogan's Heroes continued to air, Bob's desire to control his image intensified. He began experimenting with video cameras, initially using them to capture moments of family life. But soon, the lines blurred between capturing memories and controlling them. Bob had always measured himself against the expectations of others, but now, the lens of the camera allowed him to capture every aspect of his life, every private moment, every intimate encounter. It wasn't enough to just act, he needed to document it, to record it, to relive it over and over again. The irony of Bob Crane's life was that, despite the laughter and fame he provided the world, he was deeply insecure. His image as the wholesome, family-friendly man of Hogan's Heroes became an anchor, but also a prison. The world loved the character he portrayed, but Bob was never sure that the man he was could ever measure up to that ideal. As his personal life unraveled and his career began to fade, Bob found himself increasingly turning to his recordings, his tapes, his photographs, as a way to preserve the image of perfection he so desperately needed. His obsession with control off-camera mirrored the command he exerted over his role on screen. On the set of Hogan's Heroes, Bob was the consummate professional. He would rehearse his lines until they were etched into his memory, and he expected the same level of commitment from his co-stars. His drive for perfection often put him at odds with those around him, but it also ensured his success. But away from the cameras, where no one was watching, Bob began to lose control. The tension between the public persona of Colonel Hogan and the man who was slowly drowning in his own need for validation would eventually come to a head. Bob Crane was no longer just an actor. He was a man who had created a character so real that even he could not escape it. And in that escape, he would eventually lose everything. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with "I am still here." Let's see who is still watching. In the years following the end of Hogan's Heroes, Bob Crane faced the uncomfortable silence of a career that once resonated with laughter. The TV show, which had made him a household name and America's favorite colonel, had wrapped in 1971. But the applause faded quickly. While the rest of the world moved on, Crane found himself in a peculiar limbo, familiar to any once famous actor, the post-show plateau. It was not just a career hiccup, it was an existential crisis. Bob, who had once been adored for his quick wit and charm, now watched as younger, fresher faces filled the roles that he once owned. The transition from Hogan's Heroes was harder than he had imagined, and despite multiple offers, none of the roles lived up to the success he had found on the show. The steady paycheck was gone, but more significantly, so was the validation. Bob had always measured his worth by the applause of others. The accolades, the laughter, the fame, they were more than just byproducts of his career. They were his lifeblood. Without them, he felt adrift. As a result, he sought solace in something that promised control, something tangible, something real. In 1974, Bob bought his first Sony Portapak, a consumer-grade video recorder. To most people, it was simply a new way to capture home memories, but for Bob, it represented a shift, a new stage, this time with him behind the lens. The video camera wasn't just a tool for him, it was a way to curate his own life. The perfectionism that had once driven his career now extended to his personal world. The camera allowed him to document, control, and most importantly, preserve every part of his life. It was a form of immortality. For Bob, the camera became more than a tool for documentation. It became his stage, his ultimate performance. He no longer cared just about how he was seen by the world, he wanted to control how he saw himself. The tapes, the footage, the endless reels became his new audience. The man who once commanded attention from millions now sought to command it from the people around him, through the power of the lens. The world he had once charmed through humor and charisma was now reduced to a private spectacle, a world in which he was both the director and the only viewer. But there was a danger in this new form of control. As Bob became more entrenched in his obsession with filming, the performer in him began to overshadow the man beneath the surface. It wasn't just about capturing moments, it was about manipulating those moments. Bob had always been the center of attention, but now, even in the quietest, most private moments, the camera would capture his every move, every word, and every glance. What had once been a tool for entertainment became a tool for control, and that power would soon prove to be his undoing. The camera became his new stage, and this time, the audience was himself. But like any performance, the truth always lurks behind the curtain. And as the lens fixed itself firmly on Bob, it was not just his life that was being filmed, it was his identity, his relationship with others, and his very humanity that was slowly being eroded, frame by frame. In the early 1970s, Hollywood was undergoing a transformation, a shift that would redefine its moral fabric. The sexual revolution had taken hold, and behind the glittering facade of glamour, personal lives were becoming more openly discussed, more candidly explored. No longer confined to the shadows, the boundaries of morality were being tested in public. Bob Crane, once the quintessential all-American hero, found himself at a crossroads. His rise to fame had come with a price, the performance never stopped. The cameras, the stage, the laughter, all were constant. But now, with his show Hogan's Heroes behind him and his career in decline, Bob faced the disorienting silence of the post-fame abyss. The applause had faded, and with it, his sense of purpose. It was in this void that Bob found something new, something that offered him the same control he had once experienced in front of the cameras. He bought his first Sony Portapac, an early video recorder. To most, it was a simple gadget, a way to capture memories. But for Bob, it was a lifeline. The device gave him power, not just over what was filmed, but over how he could now curate his own narrative. The lens allowed him to document, manipulate, and own his life in a way that nothing else had. He wasn't just capturing moments anymore, he was creating them, carefully constructing a version of himself that was always on display. As the tapes began to accumulate, the camera became Bob's new stage, a performance that only he could control. Enter John Carpenter, the video equipment salesman who would become Bob's closest companion in this new phase of his life. Carpenter was an intelligent, charismatic man, but there was something behind his charm, an underlying loneliness that Bob didn't notice at first. Their bond began innocently enough, founded on their shared interest in technology, gadgets, and the new frontier of video recording. They spent hours together, often at jazz clubs or in the quiet corners of Los Angeles, talking about the power of film and the potential of capturing life's most intimate moments. But as their friendship deepened, so did their obsession with the camera. What started as a hobby, filming parties, casual conversations, and late-night jazz sessions, soon escalated into something more. Bob, the consummate performer, began using the camera as a way to control his image, his reality. It wasn't enough to simply exist, Bob needed to be seen, recorded, validated. The camera became his confidant, his partner in performance. But Carpenter, too, began to realize the power of the lens. What had been a shared interest became a mutual obsession. As they filmed their experiences, it wasn't just about the record of their lives anymore, it was about who controlled the footage, who had the power to dictate what was remembered and how it was seen. Bob's growing fascination with filming quickly turned into an obsession, and soon, it was no longer just about preserving memories. It was about domination. The footage was his new form of ownership. The more Bob filmed, the more he became enthralled by the idea that he could shape every aspect of his life. The tapes, once a simple means of documentation, now carried a darker purpose. They became a way to capture not just moments, but people, the women he encountered, the private conversations he had, the intimate experiences he shared. It wasn't enough to just record them, he needed to possess them in a way that only the camera could allow. At the same time, the relationship between Bob and Carpenter began to shift. What had started as a friendly partnership soon grew more complex. Carpenter, who had once been content simply observing Bob's life, began to feel left behind. Bob's increasing obsession with the camera, his desire to control every aspect of his personal world, started to create tension. Carpenter, once a trusted ally, began to feel that he was no longer just a companion, he was a witness, an accessory to Bob's performance. And that wasn't enough. Carpenter wanted more. As Bob's obsession with filming grew, so did Carpenter's jealousy. The tapes that were supposed to document their shared experiences now became a symbol of control and power. Bob's home, once a place of family and normalcy, began to transform. It became a mini-studio, a space lit by the flicker of monitors late into the night. The glow of the screens, which once held the potential for creative expression, now became the symbol of Bob's obsession. As the footage mounted, so did the emotional distance between Bob and the rest of his life. Sigrid Valdis, his second wife, grew increasingly frustrated by his detachment. The more Bob sank into his recordings, the further he drifted from her. Their conversations, once filled with affection, became strained, punctuated by the sound of the camera rolling. Bob no longer saw his wife as a partner, she became a subject, a character in his personal documentary. The lines between reality and performance began to blur, and the intimacy that once defined their relationship began to crumble under the weight of his obsession. The more Bob filmed, the more he alienated those around him. His friends, his family. None of them were immune to his need to capture and control. The tapes became his primary relationship, his primary interaction with the world. Sigrid's frustration mounted as she realized that the man she had married was no longer the loving husband she had once known, but someone who had replaced genuine connection with the illusion of control. As the tapes continued to accumulate, the question began to shift from who is in the footage to who is controlling the footage. Carpenter, now feeling increasingly marginalized, began to push back against Bob's dominance. The tension between the two men became more palpable as Carpenter, once content to film as Bob's silent partner, began to assert his own claim to the tapes. This shift from collaboration to competition turned their once innocent hobby into a battle for control. Carpenter wasn't just filming anymore, he was manipulating the narrative. The tapes became evidence of their growing rivalry, a rivalry that threatened to tear their friendship apart. The most chilling aspect of Bob's obsession with filming was the way in which the footage began to serve as his only means of connection. His life, once filled with laughter and camaraderie, became a series of silent, static images. Each tape became a reflection of his need for control, for validation, for recognition. The more he filmed, the more isolated he became. The man who had once commanded the stage in front of a national audience was now alone in a dark room, staring at a screen, replaying his own life, unable to connect with the people around him. And then, in June of 1978, something shifted. The camera stopped rolling. The tapes, which had once chronicled every moment of Bob's life, stopped accumulating. One final reel, the last recording of the life Bob had carefully curated, was never found. It was as though the camera itself had recognized the weight of Bob's obsession and had decided to end the performance. The footage, which had once been a symbol of control, was suddenly gone, leaving behind only the silence of what had been lost. The tapes remained, but the questions they raised were far from over. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. By 1977, Bob Crane found himself standing at a crossroads, and the road ahead was far less glittering than he had imagined. His days as Colonel Robert Hogan on Hogan's Heroes seemed like a distant memory. The fame, the accolades, and the constant spotlight had faded, and Bob's life had taken a turn that left him grappling with something far more personal than public success. The world had moved on, but he remained stuck in the past. His attempts at reinvention, through regional theater and small roles, only served to remind him of his diminishing relevance. The offers, once steady and full of promise, had become few and far between. The once legendary star of a beloved sitcom was now a man of nostalgia, longing for the fame that had once been his, but unsure of how to reclaim it. Bob's personal life had mirrored the decline of his professional career. His marriage to Ann Terzian had ended in 1970, and his subsequent marriage to actress Sigrid Valdis in 1971, while publicly solid, was quietly fraying. The vibrant family life he had once depicted seemed like an illusion, as he grew more isolated and detached. His marriage to Sigrid, which once held promise, now felt like a delicate facade, strained under the weight of his obsession with control, perfection, and, most of all, the camera. Bob no longer saw himself as a family man first, he had become the star of his own personal documentary, the lens of the camera recording every interaction, every moment, every flaw. The phone calls with his son Robert in the months leading up to his death were some of the last moments of connection Bob had with his family. In those calls, there was an undeniable fatigue in his voice. He had been the voice of optimism and laughter for so many years, yet now, that voice carried an undercurrent of remorse and loss. Robert, in his early 20s at the time, could hear the change. It wasn't just the passing of time, it was the weight of a man who realized that his best years were behind him. There was no longer the excitement in Bob's words, the enthusiasm for life and new beginnings. There was only the heavy acknowledgement of a career plateau and a life that seemed to have turned in on itself. Bob's attempts at reinvention felt more like a desperate act than a fresh start. He wrote letters to friends, telling them about his desire to start fresh, but those letters felt like a final effort to reclaim something that had already slipped away. His struggle for relevance became a part of his identity, his obsession with control through the camera was no longer just about documenting life, it was about preserving a piece of himself that was fading from view. The camera had once been his tool of creation, but now it was his tool of preservation, capturing a reality he could no longer touch or experience authentically. June 28, 1978, marked a pivotal moment in Bob's journey, the last night he would share with John Carpenter. The two men, once friends united by their shared fascination with video equipment and the power of the camera, had become estranged. What had once been a mutual obsession had soured. Carpenter's increasing jealousy and Bob's growing sense of alienation from the world around him created a tension that could no longer be ignored. The final dinner between them was less of a reunion and more of an awkward reckoning. Those who were present at the meeting recalled the uneasy silence that hung over the evening. It wasn't just a matter of two old friends catching up, it was a final confrontation, the quiet end of a relationship that had been defined by control and competition. Carpenter, once Bob's closest ally, now felt like an outsider in a life that was no longer his to share. The dinner was punctuated by long pauses, moments when the air between them grew thick with unspoken words. Bob, now emotionally distant, seemed almost detached, as if the conversation had lost all significance. He was no longer the charismatic star who had filled rooms with his laughter, instead, he was a man weighed down by regret and the realization that the relationships that once mattered to him were slipping away. For Bob, this dinner with Carpenter was not just the end of their friendship, it was symbolic of the broader collapse of the life he had built. The joy of fame, the adoration, the camaraderie, everything that had once made him feel whole had faded, leaving behind only an echo of what had been. The dinner was a final acknowledgement of loss, of his place in the world, of the person he had once been, and of the relationships that had been sacrificed in pursuit of perfection. That night, Bob returned home to the silence of his house, the same silence that had been creeping in for years. His home, once filled with laughter and familial warmth, had become a mini-studio, a place where the glow of the monitors was the only light that illuminated his existence. The cameras, once a tool for expression, had become his prison. The glow from the monitors, flickering in the dead of night, reflected not the warmth of family but the cold, sterile isolation of a man who had lost touch with the world outside his own lens. Bob, the man who had once made America laugh, was now alone with his tapes, his legacy reduced to static images and recorded moments. For Bob, There was no escape from the performances that had defined his life. The man who had once captivated audiences with his charisma and humor now sat in front of a screen, rewatching himself over and over. The camera, which had once been his ally, now captured a man who had lost his identity in the very act of preserving it. The tapes were more than just footage. They were testaments to his failure to connect with the people who had once mattered most to him. The tapes themselves, his personal archive of desire, were now the only thing that remained. But even in his final days, the tapes could not save him. They had become a symbol of everything Bob had sacrificed, his career, his relationships, and his very self. What had once been an attempt to capture and control his life had become his final entrapment. The evening of June 29, 1978, was supposed to be just another night in the quiet monotony of Motel 214. The small, nondescript building was tucked away in a corner of Scottsdale, Arizona, far from the limelight and scrutiny of Hollywood. Yet that night, behind the peeling wallpaper and dim lighting, a tragic end awaited a man who had once been the face of laughter and patriotism on the small screen. Bob Crane's murder, as sudden and violent as it was, would soon become the focus of a media storm that would shift his story from one of public admiration to public spectacle. What had been a night of solitude would soon be transformed into a crime scene, a flashpoint that blurred the lines between tragedy, obsession, and media exploitation. The forensic team, upon arriving at the scene, found a room that felt almost too quiet, too still, like a performance waiting for its next act. The lack of forced entry made the investigators' stomachs turn. Bob had known his killer. The blood spatter analysis would later reveal the extent of the violence. Blunt force trauma had been the fatal blow, but it was the cord marks around his wrists that were the most chilling. They spoke to something deeper, an act not just of violence, but of control. Bob Crane had been restrained, as if to ensure that he was a captive, a subject in the very performance he had been so consumed with throughout his life. There was a subtle but telling smear of blood on the door handle, and perhaps more disturbing, a trace of blood found in Carpenter's rental car. The connection between Carpenter and the crime was undeniable, yet the true extent of his involvement remained uncertain. The blood trail and the presence of his car seemed to suggest an intimate relationship, but investigators were still left with more questions than answers. No forced entry signaled that Bob had let the killer into the room, a quiet and shocking realization. Had the man who once charmed millions with his smile now let someone into his life, into his personal space, with the same trust he had shown on screen? The physical evidence was damning, but there were no definitive answers, just endless questions. As the investigation unfolded, the toll of Bob's murder rippled outward, impacting not just his professional world, but his family. Robert Crane, Bob's son, was the first to hear the tragic news. The call came on a quiet afternoon, breaking the calm with a sudden and painful clarity. Bob was no longer just dad, he was now a victim, a name that would soon be splashed across newspapers and tabloids. Robert's reaction was one of shock, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of loss. He had known his father as a figure of laughter, of warmth, and now, all of that seemed hollow. Bob's life had been public, a narrative woven into the fabric of American culture, but in death, he became just another headline, another tragic story for the media to devour. For Robert, this moment marked the shift from seeing his father as a person to seeing him as just another tragic celebrity, a man whose life had been defined by public admiration and now reduced to something far less personal. The news of Bob's death quickly went from tragedy to scandal. The discovery of hundreds of tapes and photographs, many of them sexually explicit, shocked the public. What had once been Bob's personal archive of memories and performances was now laid bare for the world to see. The private man who had once been America's clean-cut, wholesome hero was now exposed as someone far more complicated, and, to the public, far more controversial. Bob's double life, the one that had been hidden beneath the surface, was now out in the open. His personal desires, captured on film, painted a portrait of a man consumed by his own obsession with control and image. The tapes, once his means of self-expression, now became evidence of betrayal. The media quickly seized upon this new angle, framing Bob as a voyeur, a man whose life had been defined not by his role as a beloved TV star, but by his private, darker passions. What followed was a frenzy of gossip, speculation, and exploitation. The press didn't mourn Bob, they pounced. The tapes, once considered private, became the centerpiece of a scandal that eclipsed the tragedy of his murder. The public, once devoted to him as a fatherly figure, now turned their attention to his secrets. Headlines read less like obituaries and more like sensationalized tabloid stories. America's mourning turned to gossip, as the country turned its gaze not toward justice but toward the salacious details of Bob's secret life. The tapes, which Bob had created to preserve his memories, were now exploited to sell stories. His life had become a commodity, his death an opportunity for the media to make a profit. In the midst of this media circus, the investigation shifted focus. John Carpenter, once Bob's closest ally, now stood at the center of the storm. The connection between Carpenter and the tapes, the photos, and the murder scene could not be ignored. Investigators turned their attention to him, and as the pressure mounted, Carpenter's loyalties began to waver. Friends and acquaintances were divided. Some defended him, claiming he was just a friend caught in the crossfire of a tragic event. Others, however, began to question how much Carpenter had known, and whether he had been involved in something darker than anyone had realized. The question of whether Carpenter was guilty or innocent was complicated by his own obsession with the tapes and the nature of his relationship with Bob. Was he just another victim of Bob's obsession, a man caught in the web of a friendship gone awry? Or had Carpenter's jealousy and manipulation played a role in Bob's tragic end? The investigation was shrouded in doubt, and the media's focus only added to the confusion. The lines between friendship and betrayal had blurred beyond recognition. Meanwhile, the media continued to exploit Bob's death, pushing the investigation into the background and focusing instead on the spectacle. The tapes, the photographs, the details of Bob's personal life, everything was fodder for the press. The media's role in framing Bob's story shifted from mourning a loss to exploiting a scandal. This was no longer about Bob Crane, the man. This was about Bob Crane, the fallen star, and the media capitalized on it. They reconstructed his life, not as a man of humor and charm, but as a voyeuristic figure, a man whose private world was as corrupt as the media made it out to be. The mourning for a man who had once brought joy to millions was quickly replaced by salacious headlines, and the public turned its attention to the details, the exploitation, and the ratings. By the time the case finally reached trial in 1992, Bob Crane's death was no longer just a murder, it had become an enigma wrapped in media frenzy and endless speculation. The investigation that had begun with hope for justice had unraveled into a series of conflicting narratives, each more sensational than the last. It had been 14 years since Crane's violent death in Motel 214, but only now, with advances in forensic science, did the case get the break it needed. The blood smear found on the hotel door handle and the blood in Carpenter's rental car were reanalyzed, and modern technology confirmed a chilling connection: John Carpenter had been in the room. In a courtroom full of anticipation, Carpenter, once the trusted friend and confidant of the murdered TV star, was now facing charges for his involvement in the death of Bob Crane. The prosecution's timeline painted a clear, damning picture. They laid out the events, presenting forensic evidence that tied Carpenter to the crime scene, the blood trail, and his unsettling presence in Crane's life. The rental car, which had been crucial in tracing Carpenter's movements, seemed to speak volumes, an undeniable clue that placed him at the scene of the crime. The evidence was compelling, and for a moment, it seemed as though justice might finally be within reach for the family, for Bob. Yet, the defense was quick to undermine the prosecution's case. They questioned the integrity of the forensic evidence, alleging that the blood samples had been contaminated during the investigation. They pointed to the handling of the evidence and suggested that the blood smear was not as incriminating as it seemed. Circumstantial evidence, the defense argued, could not be enough to convict someone. The lack of a clear motive became the focal point of their case. They maintained that there was no tangible proof of Carpenter's intent to kill Bob, just the troubling coincidence of his presence. With no clear weapon, no confession, and no eyewitnesses, the defense painted Carpenter as a victim of circumstance, swept up in a tragic series of events. The courtroom became a battleground of contradictory truths, with emotionally charged arguments flying back and forth. The trial was as much about the murder of Bob Crane as it was about the mystery of his life. The public had already read the headlines, the gossip, the exposés on Bob's secret life, his obsession with filming his encounters, and his descent into the darker corners of Hollywood's underbelly. But here, in this courtroom, the fact of the crime was still trying to be pinned down amidst a blur of speculation and past relationships. The visual contrast between an elderly Carpenter, now far removed from the younger man in the prime of his friendship with Bob, and the frozen-in-time photographs of Crane, highlighted the tragic loss of youth, of life. Carpenter, now a man of advancing age, appeared tired, almost resigned. But the photos of Bob, vibrant and smiling from his glory days on television, contrasted sharply, underscoring the stark divide between the past and present, between the man who once brought joy to millions and the man reduced to a suspect in a decades-old crime. Despite the compelling arguments from the prosecution and the mounting evidence that seemed to point directly to Carpenter, the jury ultimately acquitted him. It was a stunning conclusion to a case that had captivated the public and divided opinions for over a decade. The acquittal came down to the fact that no concrete evidence could definitively prove Carpenter's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense's claims of contamination held weight, and the jury, perhaps weary of the circus surrounding the case, chose to deliver a verdict that left the public stunned but unfulfilled. Bob Crane's murder remained officially unsolved, and Carpenter, though now publicly cleared, still bore the weight of suspicion. His victory in court seemed hollow, an empty verdict, as he was left to live with the shadow of a crime that would forever be linked to his name. The verdict of innocence was officially delivered, but for anyone following the case, particularly those close to Bob Crane, the outcome felt profoundly wrong. The legal system had done its job, but the public's perception of Carpenter's role in Bob's death remained clouded by doubt. The trial had been a journey toward justice, but it had instead left a trail of confusion and unresolved grief. Bob Crane's life, his legacy, had been reduced to a murder mystery, a scandal, a tragedy with no closure. In the years following the trial, Carpenter would fade into relative obscurity. He lived his life in the shadow of the public's perception, still insisting that he had done nothing wrong, that he had been wrongfully accused. But for those who followed the case, the lingering question remained, was Carpenter truly innocent, or had justice failed Bob Crane once again? Carpenter's insistence on his innocence did little to erase the whispers, the suspicions, the accusations that followed him. In 1998, Carpenter passed away, his life defined by his connection to a murder case that remained unsolved, his final words still insistent in his defense. He left behind a legacy, not as a beloved friend or a loyal companion to a fallen star, but as a man linked to the dark shadow of Bob Crane's death. For the Crane family, the trial was another bitter chapter in a long story of grief and disillusionment. Robert Crane, now a grown man, had hoped that the trial would bring some form of closure, a sense of justice for his father. But the verdict left him with no answers, only more questions. Bob's death, once a personal tragedy, had become a public spectacle, a media-driven frenzy that had blurred the lines between truth and exploitation. The media's focus on the tapes, the photos, the secret life of Bob Crane, had overshadowed the loss of a father, a man, and a friend. The public, once mourning the loss of an icon, had turned Bob into a commodity, feeding off the scandal and the uncertainty that surrounded his death. Bob Crane's murder may have been legally unsolved, but in many ways, the real tragedy lay in what followed, the public exploitation of his life and death. The trial, the media spectacle, and the incomplete justice all pointed to the same conclusion: the truth had been lost in the noise, consumed by the sensationalism of celebrity culture. Justice, in this case, was not served. Instead, the memory of Bob Crane, the man who had brought joy to millions, was reduced to something far less pure, a headline, a scandal, a spectacle for the world to consume. The years following Bob Crane's death seemed to stretch endlessly. The unresolved questions about his murder lingered, fueling speculation, theories, and conspiracy. The public's fascination with his life, the wholesome TV star who had captivated audiences on Hogan's Heroes, evolved into something darker. His tragic death in Motel 214 became more than just a news story, it became a mystery, a story of betrayal, obsession, and exploitation that never seemed to end. But in 2016, a new chapter in the investigation was written, offering hope for those still seeking justice, though it would be a hope that ultimately led to more ambiguity than clarity. Modern forensic science had come a long way since Bob's death in 1978. DNA testing had advanced to a point where traces left behind could now be analyzed with unprecedented precision. And so, the blood found on the door handle in Bob's motel room and in John Carpenter's rental car was re-examined using newer, more reliable techniques. This was the breakthrough that everyone had hoped for, the chance to definitively answer the question of whether John Carpenter, the man with whom Bob had shared a deeply complicated relationship, had been involved in his murder. The forensic results were startling, but not in the way anyone expected. Despite the mounting evidence, the results of the retesting were ultimately inconclusive. The DNA linked Carpenter to the crime scene, yet it wasn't enough to confirm his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The forensic evidence, while compelling, was still insufficient to close the case. There was still the nagging question, had Carpenter been involved, or had the evidence been contaminated over time? The ambiguity of the results meant that Bob Crane's murder remained a mystery, with no concrete answers to bring any closure. For those who had followed the case, this outcome was profoundly frustrating. They had hoped that modern science, with its promise of clarity, would finally provide the definitive evidence they had been waiting for, but instead, they were left in the same place they had started, unsure and empty-handed. The sense of resolution that had felt so close only moments before slipped away, leaving in its place more unanswered questions. Despite the unresolved murder, Bob Crane's story was far from over. His life, once confined to television sets, had taken on new dimensions in the digital age. Podcasts, YouTube documentaries, and even a 2002 biopic, Autofocus, had resurrected Bob's story for a new generation. This digital resurrection brought his tragic tale back into the public eye, but it wasn't just about revisiting the past, it was about examining the legacy of a man whose life and death had been documented to such a degree that it now seemed like an unending performance. For modern audiences, the story of Bob Crane had morphed from the tale of a beloved sitcom star to something darker, something more complicated. His life had always been captured on film, but now it was being rebroadcast in a world of infinite digital records, forever available for public consumption. The resurgence of interest in Bob Crane's life wasn't just a matter of revisiting the past, it was about confronting a new reality, the reality of how we consume celebrity, exploit tragedy, and perpetuate stories for our own entertainment. Bob Crane's addiction to being filmed was now seen as prophetic. In a world where everyone records, where every moment is captured and shared, Bob's obsession with the camera seems like an eerie precursor to the social media culture that would come to dominate the decades following his death. The desire to be seen, to document every aspect of one's life, had become so widespread in the modern era that it was now the norm. Bob had done it instinctively, and now we all did it. Robert Crane, Bob's son, played a significant role in this resurrection of his father's story. In 2015, Robert published a memoir titled Crane, Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder. For Robert, the act of writing the book was a way to make sense of the two versions of Bob, the father and the public figure. The memoir allowed him to reflect on the complexities of growing up in the shadow of a celebrity, on the pain of losing his father in such a public, tragic way, and on the legacy of a man whose life had been defined by both glory and scandal. But while the book offered emotional closure for Robert, it also raised new questions. The questions Robert grappled with were the same ones that the public had been asking for years. Who was Bob Crane, really? Was he the funny, wholesome man we saw on screen, or was he someone entirely different, someone whose private life was as complicated, dark, and self-destructive as the one shown in the tapes and photographs that had surfaced after his death? The memoir didn't provide all the answers. In fact, it only deepened the mystery. But it did allow Robert to process his own grief and, in some ways, to reclaim a version of his father that felt more authentic, more complete, than the one the media had created. Through his father's story, Robert found a way to reconnect with a man he had never really known, both the man he loved and the one he resented. But Bob's legacy, like his life, would never be confined to the past. With the digital resurrection of his story, his addiction to being seen became a focal point of modern discussions about the way we live today. In a world where every moment, every emotion, and every experience is shared and stored, was Bob Crane the first victim of this need to document everything, or was he simply ahead of his time? As social media exploded in the decades following his death, it became clear that Bob had unwittingly predicted the endless cycle of self-documentation that would define the digital age. His obsession with filming his life, his desire to capture every moment, every intimate encounter, every private reflection, wasn't just a quirk, it was a harbinger of the world that we now live in, where everyone is constantly on camera, constantly being watched, constantly performing. Bob Crane's life and death, captured on tape and immortalized in the public eye, have been dissected, debated, and consumed by an audience that seems just as obsessed with the idea of Bob Crane as it is with the mystery of his death. In the end, Bob's obsession with visibility, with recording and controlling his own image, seems more than just an individual flaw. It is now a cautionary tale for our times. Did Bob Crane, in his relentless need to preserve every detail of his life, become a victim of the very thing he sought to control? Or, as the world now asks, did he predict the endless cycle of exposure and consumption that defines our era? Bob Crane's legacy is an intricate tapestry woven with public adoration and private scandal, a dichotomy that continues to shape how the world remembers him. In the decades following his death, Bob Crane was mostly remembered through the lens of Hogan's Heroes, the sitcom that made him a household name. To millions, he was Colonel Hogan, the charming, quick-witted star who made light of wartime tensions. His infectious smile and affable presence on screen cemented him as an American icon. But the shadows of his secret life cast a long, dark stain on this image. In the wake of his death, a string of revelations about his obsession with filming his private life, his sexual escapades, and his personal desires shattered the persona he had so carefully cultivated. The tapes, which were once part of a private archive, became a prison of his own making, an enduring symbol of the double life he had hidden from the world. Over time, the memories of his co-stars from Hogan's Heroes were colored by this dual reality. Interviews and archival quotes offer a deeply contrasting picture of Bob as they reflect on their time working with him. For some, Bob was the charming professional, the generous friend who brought warmth and humor to the set. They remember his light-hearted nature and the camaraderie that defined their time together. But for others, the awkward silences and underlying tension that arose as Bob's private life became public knowledge have left a sense of discomfort. It's a dissonance between the man they knew and the man he became in the public eye. Bob's once innocent image was irrevocably tainted, and those who had once admired him found themselves torn between affection and unease. This contrast is not just about the man Bob Crane became after his death, but about how he was redefined posthumously. The public's fascination with his private life, the tapes, the photographs, the voyeuristic glimpse into his world, transformed his legacy from that of a beloved TV star into that of a tragic figure. The tapes that had once been part of Bob's obsession with documenting his life became the center of a media spectacle, shifting the narrative from one of heartfelt remembrance to one of gossip and exploitation. Bob's legacy was no longer confined to the warmth of his character on television, but to a deeper, darker narrative that audiences couldn't seem to look away from. The question of how to remember Bob Crane became more complicated in the years after his death. Was he to be remembered for the roles he played, for the moments of joy and laughter he gave to millions, or for the darker aspects of his personality that emerged posthumously? In many ways, Bob's story became a reflection of the broader issues within celebrity culture. Fame, for all its adoration, can easily be turned into a commodity, and in Bob's case, his death made him a figure of both grief and spectacle. His murder was a tragic loss, but the media's obsession with his life and death ensured that his story would never fade into quiet remembrance. This is where the moral mirror of Bob Crane's story becomes most apparent. Bob's own obsession with being seen, with recording his most private moments, became prophetic in ways he could never have imagined. We live in a world now where self-documentation has become second nature. Social media, with its constant barrage of images, stories, and videos, mirrors Bob's own obsession with capturing life on camera. But while Bob's camera was meant to document moments of intimacy, today's camera captures virtually every moment of our lives, often without us even realizing it. In this sense, Bob was ahead of his time, but he was also a victim of it. His need for validation through the camera was a precursor to the culture of performance that dominates today's world. The need to be seen, to be remembered, to be validated by the gaze of others, is a ubiquitous part of modern existence, and Bob Crane's tragic story highlights the dangers of living in a world where private moments are never truly private. In 2015, Robert Crane published a memoir, Crane, Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder, attempting to reconcile the two conflicting images of his father, the beloved public figure and the man behind the scandal. For Robert, writing the book was a chance to make sense of the man he had known as a father and the icon he had become. But while the memoir gave Robert some personal closure, it also opened new questions. Was the father Bob Crane's memory had become defined by the public the same person his son had known? Could the legacy of Bob Crane, so irrevocably tainted by the media's sensationalism, ever be healed? Robert's journey to understanding his father's legacy was filled with conflict, a man torn between love for the father he had known and the discomfort of being forced to reckon with his father's private life, which had become an entertainment commodity for the masses. The very idea of legacy was now contested in a world where Bob's tapes, his actions, and his death were turned into a public spectacle. Robert's memoir added another layer to the ongoing conversation about celebrity and voyeurism in modern culture. Bob's addiction to being filmed is now seen in a new light. In our society today, where people routinely document their every move through photos and videos, Bob's obsession seems less like a personal failing and more like a reflection of society's current obsession with visibility. It raises the question of how much control we have over our own narrative, and how much of it is shaped by the external pressures of society, media, and public consumption. In a world where everyone is a performer, Bob Crane's addiction to being seen seems less like a choice and more like a symptom of a larger societal shift toward exposure and visibility. Bob's life was, in a sense, a warning about the dangers of living for the camera. His obsession with recording his life, his intimate encounters, his personal moments, and his public persona, led to his downfall. But it also foreshadowed the world we live in now, where the boundaries between public and private are increasingly blurred. Today, everyone has a camera at their fingertips, capturing moments that were once private, making everything accessible and available to the world. But in the pursuit of visibility, we risk losing ourselves in the process. Bob Crane, in his unwitting way, predicted this future, and in doing so, became both its first victim and its harbinger. As Bob's legacy continues to be dissected and examined, the question remains, what does it say about us, the audience, the public, and the world we live in today? In Bob Crane's life, the lens was never truly pointed outward, it was always pointed back at us. And what it captured was the sociological shift that has become so embedded in our world today. We are all watching, recording, and sometimes forgetting the reasons why. We are part of a system that takes lives, breaks them down, and turns them into media content, to be consumed and discarded, all while the lens watches silently. Thank you for your incredible support. Red Heart. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered?